Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. The end is in sight for the renovation project at the Arch Grounds. An early summer reopening is planned. One of the big changes will be changing the name of the site, and that should happen sooner rather than later. With me to bring us up to speed on the project's progress is Ryan McClure, Director of Communications and Activation for the Gateway Arch Foundation. Ryan, nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Don. Appreciate it.
Boy, we're getting to the point where we can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
We're so close. July 3rd will be the grand opening of the new Arch experience. So everything in the landscaping, the park, Keener Plaza, the riverfront, that's all been completed. The very last component, which is one of the biggest, is the expansion to the visitor center and the museum exhibits under the arch, which will be completed and open to the public by July 3rd.
I'm going to ask you to walk us through all of this in just a
Sure.
moment. But first, the name change.
Yeah.
How is that likely to change anything?
Well, I think for how people know the arch, it doesn't change a lot because so the new name would be Gateway Arch National Park as opposed to Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. Right now, the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial name is not well known, and it says nothing about the 630-foot tall iconic monument that represents our city to the entire world. So what this name change does is really give the park a formal name consistent with how people know it, and it highlights the fact that we have one of the premier urban national parks right here in downtown St. Louis. And a lot of people don't realize, even here in St. Louis, that it is a national park, and I think that'll be a big boost to tourism.
How did all of this name change thing get started?
Well, there is an alliance of organizations that support and help operate the park. That includes the National Park Service, Bi-State Development, Great Rivers Greenways, City of St. Louis, and Jefferson National Parks Association, and of course our organization, Gateway Arch Park Foundation. So as we were getting towards the grand opening, we thought that the alliance kind of thought this would be a great opportunity to see if the name could be addressed and if we could highlight the fact that this is a national park and use the momentum of the grand opening as something that could be an impetus for that. And our congressional delegation, thankfully, and we're so grateful for their support, they were all on board. So it's bipartisan. Senators Blunt and McCaskill both sponsored the bill in the Senate, and then Representatives Clay, Wagner, and Lutkemeyer sponsored the bill in the House. So we're just really grateful for the support that we got from the congressional delegation.
It's nice to see that bipartisanship is possible in Washington after all.
It is possible, and it is alive and can be done.
And now the official signing by the president is all that remains between having it happen.
That's right. So the legislation has been sent to the president's desk, and once he signs it, then we officially have a new name for the park. And it's just fantastic that this can be done before the grand opening. All of the signage, the new signage that's going to be in the park, it hasn't been printed yet. We're waiting just to make sure that the name change went through. So this isn't going to be an additional cost to taxpayers or anything like that because we had to redo the signage anyway.
Well, and everything has to be changed. Business cards, stationery, the whole ball of wax.
That's right. And if there are additional costs, again, there are organizations like ours that can help fund those from a private side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk now about where we are now in this whole renovation project. I mentioned before I'd like to have you walk us through. Let's start in downtown St. Louis and getting us to the Arch Grounds. That's one of the big changes.
Sure, absolutely. So one of the big changes just to start the visitor experience is that visitors will be parking in downtown St. Louis instead of the old Arch Garage, which was on the north side of the park, which was kind of an island. So folks would park – if you're coming into St. Louis from all over the Midwest, you'd park your car there, go to the Arch, come back down, and then get in your car and leave without ever setting foot in downtown St. Louis. So now folks will use the parking facilities in downtown St. Louis. They can get from 4th Street at the old courthouse to the arch and to the river without a stair step or intersection in their way. And that's made possible by this new park over the highway that's completed. And those fences will come down sometime in the spring so that folks can access the park that way. And then right next to the park over the highway, you have a new west-facing entrance. And how the park over the highway and the entrance changes things for the visitor experience is pretty critical, in that for the first time in the history of this monument, it is now physically connected to the city that it represents. So the visitors will cross over the highway without any cars or intersections in their way, go into the west entrance, and which is a sweeping glass facade that lets in natural light, and they can turn around and they can see the city behind them. So they're connected to that.
That was kind of the original intention, wasn't it, to be able to have a nice view of the city as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we all know what the experience is like now when you go to the Arch. You enter at the south of the north entrance, and you immediately hit security at the door, and then you go into a basement, and you kind of lose perspective of where you are and that you're still in St. Louis, and there's a reason that the Arch is here in St. Louis. So this entrance helps us physically connect people to St. Louis during their visit, and thematically we're going to be connecting people to St. Louis, because when you start going in the visitor center, you'll see a mezzanine plaza with a huge map of the United States and a big yellow dot where St. Louis is, and then all of the trails that people follow to get to the west from St. Louis. And then you'll go through the new museum, which still has a focus on westward expansion, but what's there that wasn't before is a pretty intentional focus on the role that St. Louis played in westward expansion.
Can you be a little more specific about that? Because I understand it is quite different.
Yes, absolutely. So when you start in 1600s colonial St. Louis, so that right there, that's a change. So you start the thematic and interpretive storytelling in St. Louis with the French colonial era, and then you kind of keep, as you move toward ultimately where you end up is the building of the Arch. So that's another way that you're connected in St. Louis, because the old museum didn't really have a huge storytelling element of how was the Arch built, how was it designed, why was the design chosen. So everything, and then there's a huge story zone on the riverfront era in St. Louis. So there's a model of 1852 St. Louis riverfront with the steamboats and all of the buildings that were there. So everything kind of comes back to St. Louis.
I want to let folks know that they can get into this conversation if they'd like to. 382-8255 is our number. 382-TALK is the way you can find it that way. You can also send us an email at talk@stlpublicradio.org, or if you'd prefer to send us a tweet, do so at STL On Air. We're talking with Ryan McClure, and we're talking about the renovation project at the Arch, soon to be renamed Arch Grounds, by the way. Ryan, who put the museum thing together? I mean, who was responsible for that?
Well, there are a lot of different entities that were responsible for the museum exhibit design. And it starts with the National Park Service and the great interpretive staff that they have there. Bob Moore, who's the historian at the park, has been there for quite a while, was intimately involved with all of the exhibits. And then we had the main exhibit designer is Haley Sharp Design out of the United Kingdom, and they have an amazing resume. They did the visitor center at Stonehenge. They've done a lot of the Smithsonian museums. They're actually starting a huge project at National Air and Space Museum. So they have a great resume, and they were kind of the driving force on the design, but working hand in hand with the National Park Service and then a lot of volunteers in developing these exhibits.
This overall project was pretty expensive. How much of that is the museum cost?
Sure. So the museum in total, so this includes the exhibits, the expansion, so 46,000 square foot of expansion, is about $170 million out of the $380 million total cost of the project, and the vast majority of that $170 was funded privately.
We should remind people where all this money is coming from.
Right. So the way that this breaks down, it's a $380 million project, and it is the largest public-private partnership ever in the National Park Service's history. And $221 million of that 380 is privately funded, and the vast majority of that came from St. Louis. That's the largest private investment in a national park in history. And that shows you the generosity that we have here in St. Louis from our donors and the corporate community, that we were able to raise that much private money for the renovation. So in addition to the 221, there's $90 million that came from Proposition P, which again shows you how much this community cares about the arch, that they voted to tax themselves through a sales tax initiative. For the first time in American history, a local jurisdiction taxed itself to make improvements to a national park. And then the remainder, the $69 million that makes up the 380, also came from federal, state, and local public sources.
Boy, thinking it's a third of $1 billion going into the downtown riverfront.
Right. It's a huge investment, and I hope as we move towards the grand opening that St. Louis as a community is proud of what they did here, because the vast majority of the funding came from St. Louis. And again, I think it shows how much people care about this community and how much they care about the arch and the park that surrounds it as a symbol of our community.
You mentioned parking a little while ago.
Yeah.
We have some callers who want to get into this discussion. So let's bring in Betty calling from Shrewsbury. She has a question about parking. Go ahead, Betty. You're on the air.
It's very exciting, this whole project. I wanted to check about the kind of protection people coming into St. Louis or using the garages will be receiving. Way back when, garages in downtown St. Louis were notorious for being dangerous. And then the next question I wanted to know is are there going to be electric carts that can be rented so that people who can't do a great deal of walking will have access from the garages to the arch? And thank you very much.
Sure. Well, thank you, Betty. Those are both great questions. So the answer to your first question about safety and security in the garages, before we were able to demolish the old parking garage on the arch grounds, we had to do a parking study, and we did this in partnership with Explore St. Louis, who really took on the brunt of that work, to prove that there was enough underutilized parking in downtown St. Louis to absorb those spaces. So they went around, they kind of went through all of the garages and parking lots, surveyed them, and to get into this preferred downtown parking program, they had to meet certain requirements for safety and security and lighting. There has to be attendance on staff and on-site and cameras. And then they had to meet requirements for accessibility, payment options. So one of the key elements for those facilities to be in the program was safety and security. So the second part of your question on the electric carts, Downtown STL Inc., which is kind of the booster organization for downtown St. Louis, has a program that they're piloting that will have electric carts that go around St. Louis and can get people from parking facilities to different attractions. So that's a great idea, and actually one that thankfully is looking like it's going to be implemented.
That's Ryan McClure. He is the Director of Communications and Activation with the Gateway Arch Park Foundation. We have to take a break now. We'll do that, come back, and take more of your calls. We have a number of people, Ryan, who want to talk to you. We'll do that in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. Now back to our conversation with Ryan McClure. We're talking about renovations down at the Arch. July 3rd is the big day. That's when it reopens. Ryan, that's going to be fair time, Fair St. Louis time.
That's right. We're so happy that Fair St. Louis is returning to its original home at the Gateway Arch. And, it was great to have it at Forest Park for the 4 years that we were under construction. And we're lucky as a region to have two parks that can handle an event that size. But we thought, and we're so thankful that the folks at the Fair Foundation agreed, that what better way to bring people back down to their new arch experience than to have Fair St. Louis return. So we're really excited about that. July 3rd will be the grand opening ceremony, probably late morning, and then we're probably going to have some community events that evening, and then the fair, of course, returns on July 4th.
And if things hold true to form, there'll be a thunderstorm in there somewhere. There always seems to be.
We hope not. If we could get through Fair St. Louis with this grand opening without a thunderstorm, that would just be amazing.
How many people can the grounds accommodate for an event like this?
Well, there's different answers to that question based on how things are configured and operated and set up. But, it can be between 50 and 100,000 just on the Arch Grounds, the national park proper. But then you have other spaces in downtown that can handle additional people.
I can remember covering the VP Fair downtown years ago, and it was so crowded there was actual gridlock. At times you could not move. You simply had to stay where you were until the crowd somehow shifted.
Right.
Well, incredible.
It's an entirely new orientation at the park, so I think there's a lot of spaces that can be used and disperse people than you had previously. For example, the garage is now a 7.5 acre park. So that's an area that can be programmed for all sorts of different things, and certainly for Fair St. Louis.
Yeah, you have expanded the overall area by 11 acres?
11 acres of new park space that folks can enjoy.
Let's go back to the phones. We'll bring in Lee calling from North City. Lee, thank you for waiting. You're on the air.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call.
Go ahead.
My question is in the interest of full disclosure, where the historical aspects are covered at the museum, how much attention is going to be given to the burgeoning slave trade on the riverfront? And also, is there going to be any attention given to the rigged election that gave the opportunity to buy the property on the riverfront? I'll take my answer off the air. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee.
All right. Thank you, Lee. So one of the things that has been changed at the museum under the Arch is that the storytelling is a lot more inclusive. So you're going to hear and see that the themes and the interpretive elements are told from many different perspectives. So you will there is a focus on the slave trade on the riverfront, and of course that's a part of the story at the old courthouse as well. And also you're going to hear many different perspectives of westward expansion. So it's not just the West was won, it's also the West was stolen from the people that lived there already. And then there's the perspective of the Mexican, the folks that lived in Mexico, where the North was stolen from them. So there's a lot of different ways that the story, all of these stories are going to be told.
There's still a lot of resentment in the area over the loss of many historic buildings down there that were raised to make way for this whole project years ago. People are still upset about that.
And that it's the way that was done in the 30s and the 40s. I think that you wouldn't see that done the way that we've you wouldn't see it done that way today. We've come a very long way in historic preservation and urban development. But one thing that I think we can point to in the museum where that story is embraced and we really talk about it. The old Rock House, which was one of the last buildings to left standing when all the buildings were cleared. At one point, it was the old Rock House and the old Cathedral were still there, and those were the only two buildings. The Rock House was eventually demolished, but a lot of people don't know that the Park Service preserved and kept many of the stones in the facade of the old Rock House, and that has been rebuilt in the new museum. So you pass through the facade of the old Rock House to get between story zones in the museum.
Join us in studio now is Alex Heuer, producer of St. Louis on the Air. Alex had an opportunity to visit the grounds, I guess a couple of weeks ago, Alex?
A couple of weeks ago, that's right.
What are your thoughts about what you saw down there?
The first thing that comes to mind is it seems like there's a whole lot of work still left to get done. To me, from the outsider not being involved in construction, it's hard to believe that it's going to be ready in time to open on July 3rd, but Ryan says it will be, and I believe that.
Well, wait a minute. Ryan is leaving this job. He told me just before he went on the air. He's going on to, I wouldn't say bigger and better things, just to other things. But what do you think? There's no question about it being completed.
No, it will definitely be complete. We've actually we've got some time period to account for anything that may come up, but the exhibits will be complete and everything will be done by July 3rd. But I completely understand where Alex is coming from, because if you're not involved in it every day, you could go down there right now and say, well, they've got some work to do, but we'll definitely have it complete.
Alex, you had a special interest in the museum. We've talked a little bit about that, but what were you able to see there, and what is that special interest?
It's exactly what Ryan was talking about, in the way that the story is changing, in the way that it's going to be told, where you have the different perspectives. The West was won, the West was stolen, the North was stolen. And people who went to the museum before this renovation will recall that it was laid out in those rings by decades, and it went out from there. And so it's a very, very much of a redesigned museum, and from what I can tell so far, it's going to be more interactive as well. I mean, the old museum, it just came off as pretty stale to me after a while. I mean, it didn't seem to be changed. Maybe it was, but it just seemed that it was time for an update, that it was time for a new way to tell the story. You
can't get away with that anymore, just having a room full of artifacts, can you? Today's high-tech world is changing everything.
Right. When that museum opened in 1976, it was pretty innovative for its time, but as Alex said, it really didn't get updated much after 1976, so this really brings it up to what 21st century museum goers want to see. And it is very interactive. It's immersive. There's a lot of different perspectives and storytelling that we can use technology to tell that.
And Ryan was talking about the old rock house in terms of how some of the stones there are going to be used in the replica that is being built there. One of the things that I'm interested in, I've done some reporting on archaeological work that's taken close to the Arch grounds, because when the demolition started, I think in 1939 even, that area was not protected. Archaeologists did not have a chance to get at that and preserve history. And one of the things that I'd talked about with the archaeologist from the Missouri Department of Transportation is that they intended that some of their artifacts that they found would be some way featured in the museum. How is that going to happen, Ryan?
Well, they will. You're right. So there are some artifacts that MoDOT found through their Poplar Street Bridge project, and then there are some artifacts that were found during the Arch Grounds excavation. So we had to dig down to build that 46,000 square foot expansion. So I don't know exactly where those artifacts go, but I know that they will be incorporated somehow.
Alex mentioned rings before, and we have a tweet from Tom who asks, when will the river ring be finished?
The river ring. So that's a great question for the folks at Great Rivers Greenway, because they are doing amazing work in the region, and they're a big part of this project. So I know there's a lot of really exciting things going on with the river ring. And then, what they're doing right now with the design competition on Shoto Greenway is going to be really exciting. And I know that that's scheduled to wrap up with the final design sometime in June of this year. So there's a lot of momentum, moving toward this summer with projects like that. Our project, Soldiers Memorial, will open in November on Veterans Day. Just a lot of really great things happening in St. Louis right now.
A lot going on. Let's bring in another listener, and we'll go to Victor this time. He's calling from St. Louis. You're on the air, Victor. Go ahead.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Ryan. And enjoy hearing your comments about the Arch grounds. We're really excited about that. I've been downtown for about 20 years, and we think it's really great. We're enthusiastic about the improvements to downtown and the park over the highway. But I do think that this conversation has really missed a great opportunity to promote one of the most important historic areas of St. Louis, which is the Cleves Landing. Mm-hmm. And you referred to the former entranceway on the north side, but the north side has a name, and it's the Cleves Landing. Mm-hmm. It's one of the historic starting places of all of the St. Louis story. It was built during the 1700s and 1800s, and it's the only place in the entire region where you've got historic buildings, cobblestone streets, you got great restaurants and entertainment options. And, there's a lot of new projects. About half of the landing is now being either renovated or rebuilt. Mm-hmm. And we've got some new residential projects that are going in for the first time. So we'll be the only residential developments on the St. Louis riverfront in a long enough time that none of us can remember. Yeah. And I wish that your presentation today and maybe in the future would do a better job of highlighting such an incredibly important part of St. Louis.
You've done a pretty good job of it yourself, Victor. Thanks very much for your call.
And just to Victor, you're absolutely right. And there's so much going on with this project that I unfortunately don't always get to touch on each element of it. But Laclede's Landing, the fact that this national park now goes right up to Laclede's Landing's front door is just a fantastic opportunity for downtown St. Louis. And as you said, there's such great historic building stock there that if you want to see the types of buildings that were there in the 1850s, just go to Laclede's Landing. And there is residential coming in. There's new event spaces. We toured one just north of Eads Bridge the other day that is just beautiful and fantastic. So there are a lot of exciting things going on in Laclede's Landing, and we're really excited about the momentum there.
Or go to Soulard or go to Lafayette Square.
That's
There's
right.
an awful lot of history in that part of the city.
We have a lot of great neighborhoods with great character.
We have a tweet from David who writes, as the gateway to the West, St. Louis portrayed in the new museum as part of the West or a mere gateway from the East?
It's a great question. I think it's a little bit of both. It's definitely portrayed, and we emphasize the fact that people started their journey here in St. Louis, and they started their journey where the arch is today. So it's not just about like St. Louis's role, but the role of the actual space that the people are standing on. And at one time, it was the third busiest port in America. In fact, that's highlighted in one of the exhibit zones. So it was a gateway from a lot of different areas. So it could have been, up north. It could have been from New Orleans. It could have been from the east.
One of the awesome features is when you walk in, you basically look down and you see, and it's like a big ramp that goes down. You can just look down, and then the museum is still there as it was before, but it's all connected. As you look down, one of the really interesting features is the floor design. It's this huge floor, and Ryan, you can talk a little bit about this, but it has red lines coming out from St. Louis in terms of where different journeys went from St. Louis. And so in terms of telling the gateway story, that's part of that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, Alex. This map with a huge emphasis on, you've seen it, where St. Louis is. Everything kind of emanates from St. Louis, the rivers that people traveled, the trails that they took to go out west to California, Oregon, Utah. All of that is captured in this map, and it's a huge terrazzo map. So it's beautifully created and designed, and that's also a space that it orientates its orientation for visitors, and it's an interpretive element, but it's also a space for private events where you could have your dinner or reception on this map.
I want to get another caller in, but it's going to have to be quick. Keith, calling from St. Louis, you're on the air, but please make it quick. Keith?
Okay, I'll be extremely quick. I just wanted to make a comment about just the investment of $300 million in a national park. I find it kind of grossly irresponsible. And I hate to be a killjoy, but it's just that type of money to redesign essentially what becomes a event space or a nice place for people to take wedding pictures is hard for me to really get my arms around. So if you could just comment about that. I mean, I just find it...
We will, Keith. Time's getting away from us, but we will.
That's certainly a concern that I've heard, but after all, there are voters who voted for this to happen. But one of the questions that I had, kind of what you're talking about, Keith, is why should it be the case that this is the largest public-private partnership? I mean, why should so many of the people who live in St. Louis have to spend their money for a national project? Because we heard Ryan say that this is the largest public-private partnership that the National Park Service has done.
Right. So happy to comment on that. It is the largest that they've ever done. Now, it's not the first. So there is history here for private investment and communities to help renovate and enliven our national parks. The Statue of Liberty is a great example in the 1980s, but this is the largest that's ever happened. And the funding structure for national parks has changed quite a bit recently, where there's not the federal funds that used to be there to enliven our parks, and that's why private investment is really important.
We're going to have to wrap this up, but I have a question here you can answer quickly. Wheelchair accessibility, the disabled will be able to move around okay?
Absolutely. Universal design and accessibility was a huge tenet of this project. And I think when you get there and experience this new park, you will see so many elements that have improved the accessibility that there will be a greater amount of people that can now enjoy this park.
We can't wait. Thanks to Ryan McClure for being with us, Director of Communications and Activation with the Gateway Arch Park Foundation. And Alex Heuer, thank you for dropping by and giving us your impression during your preview visit. Good to see you here, too. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.